You were never supposed to hear this. There are places in America where the ground never forgets, where trees whisper names never spoken aloud, and wind carries stories not written in any book. One of those stories begins in Kentucky, but it does not end there, because what happened in the backwoods of Pine Hollow wasn't just an event. It was a tear in the fabric of reality itself. A haunting so precise, so disturbingly factual, it left even seasoned psychologists in stunned silence. In 1987, when demolition crews tore down the old Pine Hollow church, they uncovered something far more dangerous than relics or rot, a forgotten journal buried behind the altar, wrapped in oilcloth, sealed with wax. Inside it, entries written in perfect, trembling script by Pastor William Phillips, was a 3-day account from November 1836. He recorded it all: names, conversations, secrets, and among the pages, a single line underlined in red ink: "They knew what I hid beneath the altar, and they knew why I hid it." This video isn't for the casual listener. It's for the men who sense the world isn't what it seems, who know that history has shadows, that beneath every civilization lies a grave no one wants to exhume. You're here because you're starting to remember, not events, but instincts. The twins, Rebecca and Rachel Morrison, weren't normal children. They didn't guess. They didn't imagine. They remembered things no child should know, things buried, things burned. Within 72 hours of their arrival at Pine Hollow, the congregation was fractured. Reputations were destroyed. A town's most sacred secret, one hidden beneath literal floorboards, was unearthed by 2 9-year-old girls who spoke in soft voices and shattered lives like stained glass. This isn't a ghost story. It's a mirror, one that reflects the truth people spend generations denying, that some children are born with eyes wide open, and when they look at you, they see what you pretend to bury. Before we continue, comment the phrase, "The altar bleeds truth." Type it twice, once for yourself, once for who you were before this truth found you. You're not just hearing a story, you're crossing a threshold, and there is no way back. You think you've heard strange things before, stories told in whispers at campfires, strange entries in dusty books, tales of spirits and cursed ground. But what happened in Pine Hollow isn't folklore. It's documented, it's verified, and it's unfinished. November 1836. The town of Pine Hollow sits like a scar in the hills of eastern Kentucky. Population 211, not marked on maps, not connected to any trade route. Isolated by choice. A town founded by 3 families escaping persecution. Or so they claimed. That fall, an itinerant preacher named Ezekiel Morrison arrived with his twin daughters, Rebecca and Rachel. They traveled light, a worn satchel, a threadbare Bible, and a single wooden cross with nails rusted by saltwater air. They said little, but from the moment they stepped into the town, people felt watched. Rebecca smiled at everyone. Rachel didn't speak much, but both girls had the same unnatural stillness, like mirrors waiting to reflect your most hidden thoughts. The church had been expecting Ezekiel. Letters had been exchanged. Pastor Phillips had even prepared a guest room. But when he shook the preacher's hand, he later wrote, "It was like touching a man who had just returned from his own funeral." That night, the girls were quiet at dinner, but just before dessert, Rebecca looked up and asked Phillips's wife if the roses by the east fence ever recovered from the blight. Her voice was light, curious. Mrs. Phillips went pale. No one outside the town knew about the blight. It had killed half her prized garden 3 summers ago. She had told no one, not even her husband. When asked how she knew, Rebecca smiled and said, "I saw it in a dream. The petals fell like ash. That was the moment, the first fracture, small, almost dismissible. But it was the start of an unraveling." Pastor Phillips went back to his journal that night, fingers trembling. "They see. Through time," he wrote, "or something worse, something that watches through them. You need to understand something. The twins never claimed to be prophets. They never called themselves psychic. They never needed to, because they didn't make predictions. They made revelations. And when Rachel spoke the next morning, she knew what was buried under the church. She knew why it had been hidden, and she knew the name of the man who buried it. Are you ready for that name? Then stay, because the floorboards are about to speak. The morning came like an accusation. Cold, still, no bird song, no wind, just the sound of the floor creaking beneath the weight of secrets that had slept too long. Rachel stood barefoot on the wooden planks of the sanctuary. The sun hadn't fully risen, and the pale light filtering through the church windows painted her like something half alive, half memory. Pastor Phillips found her there, alone, silent. Before he could speak, she pointed. "Third board from the altar," she said. "It's still there." Phillips froze. She wasn't guessing, because years ago, he had hidden something beneath that very board, something no one knew existed, something he had sworn never to speak of again. A bottle of whiskey wrapped in a child's blue blanket, the only thing left of the son he buried in winter, the son he couldn't save. That blanket was sacred to him, a reminder of both failure and faith. But no one had ever seen where he kept it, not even his wife. And yet, this 9-year-old girl, barefoot and solemn, had spoken the truth with surgical precision. It wasn't the first time that weekend. Because since the Morrisons' arrival, the twins had been speaking strange things to people, quietly, but always accurately. They knew who had stolen from the collection plate. They knew about the old woman's letters from a husband declared dead. They even knew about the child with a broken mind the Millers kept hidden in their attic, ashamed and out of sight. One by one, the town's secrets began surfacing, not in anger, not in judgment, just stated, cleanly, like facts written in a ledger only the twins could read. And it was this calm, cold clarity that terrified them most, because these weren't warnings, they were disclosures, revelations that left no room to hide. That Sunday, as the congregation gathered, people refused to meet each other's eyes. They fidgeted. Some wept, some prayed, but it wasn't for forgiveness. It was for time, more time to bury what they had buried. But the floorboards had already begun to groan. The past had already started to rise. And then Rebecca walked to the altar. She placed her hand on the old wooden cross carved by the founding families of Pine Hollow. Her voice didn't shake. "This is sacred ground," she said. "But it's stained." The room went still. The Wittman family didn't die in a fire. They died here, right here, in this room. Some of you know why. And the silence that followed? It wasn't shock. It was guilt. The air inside the church collapsed under the weight of that sentence. Not a sound, not a whisper, just tension, thick as fog. Rebecca stood unmoving. Her eyes, too old for her face, swept across the congregation like a blade. No one spoke. No one breathed. Until Elder Thompson rose, slowly. The man was ancient by Pine Hollow standards, bent by time, his hands knotted like roots, but his voice was still iron. "Child," he said, trembling slightly, "you speak of things that happened before you were born, things long buried. How could you possibly know what you just said?" Rebecca tilted her head. "Because they told me." She said it like it was nothing, like she was stating the weather. And then Rachel stepped forward and began to describe them. Hope and Faith Wittman, 9 years old. One had a birthmark on her shoulder, the other on her ankle. One wore a blue Sunday dress. The other was in her nightgown, too sick to get dressed the night it happened. The doll carved from birch, the silver locket with their mother's hair inside. Details. Exact, impossible, undeniable. And just like that, the dam began to crack. Whispers turned to cries. Faces flushed with memory, Heads dropped into trembling hands, because those old enough to remember the Wittmans knew not everything, but enough. The house fire had always been a lie, an official story repeated for survival, easier to accept than what had really happened. The truth? The Wittmans had come to the church that night begging for sanctuary. They were afraid, not of the wilderness, not of the elements, but of something within the community. And the church, this church, had not protected them. That knowledge had festered beneath the floorboards for 16 years, unspoken, but not forgotten, not by the soil, not by the wood, not by the twins. Outside, the wind howled for the first time in hours, as if the earth itself had been waiting for this moment to exhale. And the church? It wasn't a house of worship anymore. It had become a confessional, a reckoning. Men who had once ruled this place with their reputations now sat shaking, their mouths dry, eyes darting toward the door, as if escape were possible. But the girls weren't finished. They hadn't come to ask questions. You can't run from the past when it's already inside your walls. The Morrison twins had torn a hole in the fabric of Pine Hollow, and what spilled out couldn't be stitched back together. But the question still loomed like thunder in the rafters. How? How could two children, strangers to this place, strangers to everyone, hold knowledge that time itself had buried? Pastor Phillips, usually a man of composure, found himself trembling, not from fear of the girls, but from fear of what they proved, that the world he thought he understood never existed. Rachel turned to the pulpit and looked directly at him. "Your sermons are beautiful," she said softly, "but you've never believed a single one of them, have you?" His mouth opened. Nothing came out. "You speak of heaven," Rebecca added, "but you don't think you'll be there. You think preaching earns you forgiveness." Their words sliced deeper than accusation. They weren't condemning him. They were diagnosing him. He wanted to scream, to pray, to run. Instead, he asked, "What are you?" It wasn't a question of biology. It wasn't even spiritual. It was existential. He wasn't asking if they were human. He was asking if they were natural. Ezekiel Morrison, silent until now, finally stepped forward. His voice was low, rough as weathered bark. "They're my daughters. That's all I know for certain. But since they were 3 years old, they've been different." He stared past the congregation now, his mind caught in memories. They began to speak in their sleep. At first it was nonsense, but then they began speaking names of people we hadn't met yet, describing events that hadn't happened, sometimes places we'd never been. I tried to shield them from it. I prayed, I fasted. I even punished them when they spoke of it too much, but nothing stopped it. He paused. I began to realize it wasn't them. It was the woe, world that changed in their presence. People weren't just hearing their own secrets. They were remembering the ones they chose to forget. This wasn't possession. This wasn't a haunting. It was exposure. The girls were mirrors that stripped away illusion, not supernaturally, not mystically, but inevitably. They didn't speak to show off. They spoke to unravel control. And that is what terrified people the most. Because every institution, religion, education, even family, relies on a story we all agree to pretend is true. The Morrison twins didn't care about those stories. They came to burn them down. By nightfall, Pine Hollow had become something it had never been before. A wake. A town built on silence and sanctimony was now boiling with unspoken truths, clawing to the surface, and in the center of it all, 2 little girls who had seen too much and said just enough. Elder Thompson called for a meeting that evening, not in the church, But in the old grain barn behind the Phillips property, there was fear in the air, thick as lantern smoke, the kind of fear that makes men believe in punishment more than redemption. 20 men gathered, hands clasped, eyes wild, voices hushed. The question they asked wasn't, "Is this of God?" or even, "Is this evil?" It was, "What do we do about the Morrison twins?" Because deep down, they knew this wasn't something that could be prayed away. Old secrets had power in Pine Hollow, not because they were true, but because they were buried, and now they weren't. One of the men, Amos Wheeler, a man who had served on the settlement council since its founding, voiced what no one else dared. "We never got justice for what happened in this church," he said, his voice cracking like old timber. "We buried it. We lied to ourselves. And now these girls, they know. What if they're here to judge us?" Others weren't as poetic. One simply said, "We don't know what they are, but they're not safe." Safe for who, exactly? That's the question Ezekiel Morrison had asked a dozen times before, in a dozen towns, and he always knew the answer. Not safe for liars, not safe for men whose power depends on silence. Pastor Phillips, though shaken, refused to join the meeting. He stayed with the family that night, his instincts torn between fear and duty. The twins slept soundly, but their dreams stirred something far older than memory. At 3:14 a.m., Rebecca sat up straight in bed. Her eyes were open, but not seeing, locked onto something no one else could. "Loud perceive," she whispered. "Thompson wants to burn us." Rachel, still asleep beside her, murmured, "Let him try. The fire won't take." Their father heard them both. He didn't react. He just stared into the darkness and whispered a single word to himself. Again. Because this wasn't the first time they'd been threatened. It was just the first time this town realized what they were really afraid of. Not death, but revelation. By dawn, the lines were drawn. Not between good and evil. That would have been too clean, too convenient. No. The lines in Pine Hollow were between those willing to remember and those desperate to forget. And forgetfulness is the most dangerous addiction a community can have. At the Phillips house, Ezekiel packed, not because he feared the people. He had walked into worse storms, but because he understood the pattern. Once fear becomes collective, it needs a target. And people always choose the messenger over the message. Rebecca and Rachel dressed in silence, not with dread, but with a strange serenity, like passengers boarding a ship they already knew would sink. When Pastor Phillips begged them to stay, to let him speak to the men, to explain, Ezekiel looked him dead in the eye and said something that would haunt the pastor until the day he died. They don't fear the devil, Pastor. They fear losing the lie that saved them from him. Phillips didn't understand at first, but he would. Because as the Morrisons began their walk toward the edge of town, the church bell rang. Not the usual 3 tolls for prayer, but a single, long, dissonant cry. A call for judgment. The congregation gathered, not for worship, but for confrontation. And as Ezekiel and the twins came into view, something ancient uncoiled in the air, a memory buried so deep it had no name, only instinct. A man shouted, "They bring curses, dreams that rot the mind." Another, "They speak of the dead like they were still watching," and still another, "They make wives question their husbands, sons question their fathers. What kind of peace is that?" It was Rachel who spoke first. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse. She simply described. "You hide truth like it's a sin," she said, gazing into the crowd. "But you built your whole town on a lie. The fire didn't kill faith and hope. You did." Her words were not metaphor. They were memory. Rebecca stepped forward. And you buried their bones beneath the altar so no one would know what happens to girls who see too much. There was a moment of pure stillness. Then Elder Thompson, who had once lit a match to erase evidence of his sins, shouted, "Blasphemy!" and moved forward. What happened next would never appear in any official record, but every man present would remember it for the rest of his life. Because when Thompson raised his hand to strike Rachel, he froze, mid-motion, like a statue, mouth open, eyes wide. Then, as if forced by something invisible, he dropped to his knees and wept. No one touched the girls after that. No one dared. The town of Pine Hollow never recovered from what was remembered that day, because memory, once awakened, never sleeps again. What happened that morning in Pine Hollow would ripple through time like blood blooming in water. The official records mention nothing. Pastor Phillips, who once chronicled births and deaths with sacred precision, never wrote a word of it. That silence, in itself, is the loudest confession. After Elder Thompson collapsed in sobs, something shifted, not just in the crowd, but in the land. Men looked around as if seeing their wives for the first time. Mothers clutched their children with a tension that hadn't been there the day before, and all of them stared at the twins like they were not entirely of this earth. Rachel and Rebecca didn't flinch. They stood in the rising sun as if they had expected this moment. Pastor Phillips later recalled what frightened him most: the absence of fear in their eyes. Not arrogance, not defiance, but a kind of knowing, the eyes of those who have seen what breaks others and survived. The Morrisons left Pine Hollow within the hour. No one tried to stop them. No one even spoke. But the town never went back to normal, because you can't unsee what you've denied for decades. In the weeks that followed, Samuel Turner abandoned his farm and moved to Ohio without a word to his neighbors. Mrs. Whitfield fell into a silence so complete she never spoke again. Dr. Hayes was found wandering the woods barefoot, muttering about screaming inside the walls. And the church itself, it burned to the ground 3 months later, on a clear night. No lightning, no storm, no explanation. Some called it divine judgment, others whispered of curses, but a few, the ones who watched the Morrison girls disappear into the mist, knew Pine Hollow hadn't been cursed. It had been cleansed. Years later, when urban development finally reached the Cumberland foothills, surveyors found something buried beneath the original site of the Pine Hollow church. Just 6 small human skeletons fused into the stone foundation. 2 were later identified through family keepsakes, a silver locket and a wooden doll. The Wittman twins, Hope and Faith. They had been buried under the altar where generations prayed, not to remember, but to forget. Now I need you to remember. If you've made it this far, you're not just a viewer. You're one of us now. To lock in your identity, to confirm that you've crossed the threshold, comment the phrase, "Truth never sleeps." Truth never sleeps. Twice. Once for memory, once for awakening. This is where the descent begins. You're not here for entertainment. You're here because part of you knows something has been hidden from you your whole life, and you're ready to see it. By the time modern archaeologists arrived in Pine Hollow, the town had long vanished, swallowed by forest, silence, and forgetfulness. But the land remembered. They came under the banner of preservation, trying to catalog forgotten frontier sites. But what they found wasn't forgotten. It had been intentionally buried. Beneath the ashes of the burned church, they uncovered the bones, not just of Hope and Faith Wittman, but of others, smaller, fragile, unnamed, and all of them beneath the foundation, sealed behind stone. The official report listed it as misplaced burials, likely due to frontier desperation. But one field assistant, a woman named Dr. Amelia Hart, leaked her private notes before she disappeared from public life entirely. Her journal described something strange about the bones. The skulls of the children weren't fractured or crushed. They were perfectly intact, yet showed signs of neural drilling, tiny symmetrical holes made post-mortem, a practice not known to Baptist settlers, but known elsewhere. In ancient Rome, such practices were linked to mystery cults. In Mesopotamia, to rituals of soul containment, and in certain underground Christian heresies, to the silencing of divine voices in children believed to be vessels. Yes, vessels. Children thought to carry knowledge from beyond, not possessed, not mad, but connected. Transmitters of something older than Scripture, older than time. What if the Morrison twins weren't the first? What if what happened to Hope and Faith Wittman wasn't murder out of madness, but procedure? Phillips' silence, the congregation's secrecy, the foundation graves, all signs of a ritual structure hidden under the mask of community and worship. And here's the part you won't read in any textbook. Dr. Hart found etchings on the stones behind the altar base, faint, nearly worn away, not Latin, not English, but a kind of proto-script similar to what was discovered in the Negev desert, in caves believed to house early Christian mystics. One symbol stood out, a twisted double helix surrounded by two interlocked circles, a perfect representation of twinhood and containment, a genetic sigil, or something far older, a warning, maybe, that what had once entered Pine Hollow had to be buried in flesh and stone. Here's what you need to understand now, and I'm only going to say this once. Secrets that last for centuries don't survive by accident. They are protected, they are fed, and most terrifying of all, they are used. You're only beginning to see the architecture beneath history's surface. Good, but understand this. By continuing, you are not just listening to a story, you are agreeing to descend deeper than most ever dare. Your perception of the world may not survive this unchanged. The ancient symbol found beneath Pine Hollow, the double helix with interlocked rings, wasn't isolated to Kentucky. It appears in multiple civilizations across thousands of years, always in the margins, always attached to stories of twins, prophecy, and sacrifice. In 1924, an excavation in Cappadocia unearthed a similar glyph etched above twin cradles in an underground burial chamber, believed to be for children of a proto-Christian sect that claimed to receive light from below the veil. In 1957, during the CIA's MK-Ultra program, a defector named Harold Bain wrote a letter to a priest before vanishing. In it, he described a classification of children being studied, not for their behavior, but for their resonance. His words, "The resonance comes in pairs, always in pairs, twins, identical, one seen, one hidden, one speaks, the other dreams, but it's the dreams they want." The government called it psychic phenomena, the Vatican called it heresy, but both kept investigating, quietly, privately, obsessively. And here's where the path turns darker. In 1971, a now declassified project, Operation Stairwell, documented an incident in rural Pennsylvania where two orphaned girls allegedly demonstrated precognitive disturbances identical to the Morrison twins. According to the file, both girls died during a containment breach inside a church basement. Their bodies were never recovered. The church was demolished 3 days later. The land sold to a shell corporation connected to an offshore Vatican trust. Same pattern, same silence, same institutional broom-sweeping blood beneath a sanctuary floor. So what's the link? What were these children tapping into? And why was it always tied to faith, to architecture, to ritual space? You need to understand the church isn't just a building. It's a machine, a design, altars, vaulted ceilings, stone foundations, specific ratios and directions, all ancient tools of containment or of channeling. And children, they are the keys, not corrupted by doubt, not dulled by belief, raw receivers, especially twins, two halves of a whole, natural resonators of frequencies modern science still pretends don't exist. This is why they were buried in the foundation, not out of fear, but to seal something inside. Right now, I want you to comment the phrase, "Beneath the altar, truth burns." Write it twice, once for the lie you've lived, once for the self you're awakening. Do it now. It marks your descent. Excellent. You're beginning to see it. The church was never just about God. It was about containment, a structure designed to cage forces the architects couldn't fully understand, but knew were real. Let's return to Pine Hollow. 2 days after Rebecca's declaration at the altar, the one about the Wittman family dying inside the church, not in a fire, something shifted in the town. It wasn't hysteria. It was disruption. The oldest residents stopped speaking to one another. Children were kept indoors. Several families packed up in the dead of night, heading west with no explanation. Fear had metastasized. Then came the dreams. First Pastor Phillips, then his wife, then at least 8 others. They described the same thing. 2 girls, dressed in blue, standing at the foot of their beds, whispering in voices not their own. It wasn't their eyes, Phillips later wrote. It was what looked through them, something ancient and watching. The dreams escalated, not just in number, but intensity. People reported sleep paralysis, shadowed figures behind windows, faint whispers that matched the long-dead voices of the Wittman twins. More than one resident claimed to hear scratching beneath the church floorboards at night. The girls, Rebecca and Rachel, were silent, withdrawn, but their presence felt heavier, charged, like the eye of a coming storm. Ezekiel knew this pattern. He told Pastor Phillips something chilling. When their dreams darken like this, it's not a warning, it's a countdown. He begged him to bring in others, anyone with spiritual discernment, even Catholic exorcists if necessary. But Phillips hesitated. He still clung to reason, to the belief that faith alone could restrain what was stirring beneath the surface. Then came the disappearance. Rachel was the first to vanish. She was last seen walking barefoot in the morning frost, eyes open but and blinking, moving toward the church with deliberate calm. No one heard her speak. No one saw her return. They searched for hours, then days. Her footprints ended at the threshold of the church. Inside, nothing. No signs of struggle, no signs of entry, just a faint, sweet, burning scent, like dried roses and ash. Rebecca refused to speak. She stared at the church from the Phillips cabin window, unmoving, for 13 hours. That night, she finally whispered to her father, "She's not lost. She's where they kept the others." Ezekiel began weeping, not like a father who'd lost a child, but like a man who'd realized a seal had broken. And beneath that church, something long buried had just remembered its name. There are places on this earth where reality wears thin, where memory doesn't die. It waits. Pine Hollow was one of those places, not cursed, not haunted, engineered. When Rachel vanished, something in Rebecca broke, or awakened. She no longer acted like a 9-year-old child. Her voice deepened in tone, her eyes no longer blinked as often, and she began to speak in riddles. Fragments of names, dates, numbers that meant nothing at first, until Pastor Phillips realized she was reciting the burial records of Pine Hollow in reverse. Not the names in his journal, the real ones, the ones no one was supposed to remember. These weren't just people who died, they were people who disappeared, whose deaths were either unexplained, covered up, or never recorded at all. Some went missing during blizzards, Others vanished during church fasts or revivals, all connected to Pine Hollow, all twins. Rebecca spoke their names as if summoning them. Then she said something else, a phrase Phillips would repeat under his breath until the day he died, unable to explain why it filled him with such deep terror. The floor remembers. It feeds what you forget. Ezekiel, visibly unraveling, began to scour his journals, looking for patterns. He compared notes from dozens of congregations. The signs were there all along. Twins with dream sight, unexplained revivals, spiritual unrest, sudden disappearances. But here's what he never told anyone. Sarah, his wife, the girl's mother, wasn't his first wife. His first wife died in childbirth in 1821. She bore twins. They were stillborn, or so the midwife claimed. Ezekiel never saw the bodies. Weeks later, that midwife was found hanging in a tree, her eyes removed and stuffed with lavender stems, a symbol among Appalachian witches for truth that blinds. He never spoke of it again, until now. That night, Rebecca demanded to go to the church alone. No one agreed. She went anyway. When they found her the next morning, she was curled beneath the altar, her arms crossed over her chest, eyes open and glassy, still breathing, still alive, but not there. Pastor Phillips leaned close to hear her whisper. What she said chilled him to the marrow. She's beneath the stone. They bound her with 7 nails, but the last nail is gone. That stone, it wasn't in the church records, but it was real. And by the time they unearthed it, it was already cracked. Are you ready to go deeper? Then comment below. The 7th nail is gone. The 7th nail is gone. Let the watchers know you're awake. They called it a cornerstone, but it wasn't part of the church's foundation, not originally. It lay beneath the pulpit, under layers of rotting boards and plaster, positioned deliberately, not to support the structure, but to seal something beneath it. A flat slab of black limestone, veined with red, roughly 3 feet wide. Carved along its edge were symbols no one in Pine Hollow could read, except Rebecca. When she saw it, her body convulsed, not in fear, but in recognition. She whispered one word again and again. Sister. Not Rachel, another name. One that didn't exist in any records. Phillips sent for scholars from Lexington, a professor of theology and a stonemason who had studied Masonic cryptography. What they uncovered wasn't comforting. The markings were not Appalachian, not Latin, not even human in form. They matched carvings found in Neolithic burial sites in Europe, places associated with psychic convergence, twin sacrifices, and what one researcher chillingly called memory containment architecture. This wasn't a church cornerstone. It was a lid. The 7th nail was real. A rusted iron spike, nearly 10 inches long, had once fastened the slab's corner to a timber below it, but it had come loose. Recent rains had washed away soil beneath the church floor, allowing the stone to shift. The professor refused to return after the second visit. He claimed to see faces in the stone, not carved, but emerging, as if trying to remember themselves through time. That night, Rebecca disappeared again. They found her footprints in the graveyard, but there was no trace of her beyond the tomb of the Wittman twins, whose burial had never been properly recorded. Pastor Phillips returned to his journal, hands shaking. In the back pages, ones he'd never written, he found a new entry, inked in handwriting not his own. Memory is a body, and this place is full of teeth. 3 congregants died that week, all twins, all born in years that ended in 7. Phillips begged Ezekiel to take Rebecca and leave. But Ezekiel, hollow-eyed and barely able to speak, told him the truth. He had tried, dozens of times, across dozens of towns, but wherever the girls went, the memory followed, because they were not dreaming the past. They were remembering their own other lives, and Pine Hollow was simply where it all bled through. Pastor Phillips no longer slept. By the third night after the cornerstone was discovered, the air inside the church felt wrong, thick, dense with memory, as if each breath pulled not oxygen, but forgotten voices into his lungs. Rebecca had stopped speaking. She wandered the forest line in long, deliberate circles, murmuring numbers, not to anyone, just counting aloud in a language even Rachel didn't understand. Rachel, meanwhile, had taken to drawing. Symbols, circles within circles. One sketch in particular chilled Ezekiel to his marrow, a diagram of the church, seen from above, but with rooms and passages that didn't exist. Sublevels, crypts, and a spiral stair descending beneath the altar, vanishing into black. "It's there," Rachel said, "where the noise sleeps." Phillips dared ask, "What noise?" Rachel looked up and smiled. "The one that remembers." He knew what she meant. Every corner of Pine Hollow now held a subtle vibration, a low hum like a tuning fork pressed to the base of your spine. Most adults ignored it, but the animals didn't. Cattle refused to graze near the church. Dogs howled without cause. Birds avoided the rooftop altogether. Then came the blood rain. It lasted less than 10 minutes. Just after sunset on the 6th day, a fine red mist fell across the valley, staining the white steeple pink. Phillips thought it was dust from the quarry, until he tasted it. It was iron, copper, salt. It was blood. The twins stood outside, barefooted in the drizzle, heads tilted to the sky, laughing silently, as if the sky had remembered something they'd been waiting for. That night, 7 graves in the cemetery were found open, not dug, not disturbed, open. The soil collapsed inward, like something had pulled them from below. Each grave belonged to a twin. Rebecca finally spoke again, just before dawn. She placed her hands on Phillips's face, leaned in, and whispered, "You've been here before, Pastor. You buried us the first time." Then she turned, walked into the woods, and disappeared for 3 days. Ezekiel did not pursue her. He wept quietly into his leather-bound Bible, and when asked why, only said, "She's with them now. She always was. I was only ever delaying the memory." What is memory when it doesn't belong to this life, to this body? Are we haunted by ghosts, or by ourselves? Comment below with, "Memory is the first blood." Comment it twice, once for who you were, and once for who you're becoming. The morning Rebecca returned, she wasn't alone. She walked out of the forest barefoot, eyes wide and glassy, dress stained with black soil that smelled like rot and old wood. But she held something in her arms. Not a doll, not a book, a bone. Long, slender, unmistakably human. A child's femur, wrapped in the remains of a blue cloth. Pastor Phillips collapsed. That cloth, it was the same one that once cradled his son's body. The same cloth he had buried 5 years ago when the fever took the boy, buried miles away from Pine Hollow. No one could have known, not even Rachel. When Ezekiel saw the bone, he did not flinch. He walked to Rebecca, knelt before her, and kissed her forehead. "Has it been shown to you now?" he asked. Rebecca nodded, and for the first time in 3 days, she wept. But her tears were not grief. They were memory, dislodged, recovered, lived again. That night, Ezekiel told Phillips the full truth, the truth no man was ever meant to speak aloud. "They are not my daughters. Not in the way you think," he said. He had raised them, loved them, taught them to read scripture, to speak plainly, but they were never children, not entirely. When Sarah gave birth during the storm, she died smiling, and when he first held the twins, they were already looking at him. Not the way infants do, but with recognition. They didn't cry for hours. They didn't feed for days. And on the third night after their birth, Ezekiel woke to find them both standing upright in the cradle, staring out the cabin window toward the north, toward Pine Hollow. He believed them to be touched by God, chosen, and perhaps that was true, in part. But over time, he realized something darker. They didn't grow like other children. Not really. They remembered things they shouldn't. They spoke languages never taught, and when they looked at the dead, even animals, they would mirror. Still too loud. It hasn't forgotten yet. Phillips asked the question no sane man should. What are they? Ezekiel answered with the final verse of a scripture never found in modern Bibles. When the watchers return, they will not descend, but awaken, not from the heavens, but from the old blood, the deep sleep, and the broken twins of man. It was then Phillips understood. Pine Hollow wasn't a place the girls had come to. It was a place they had returned to. That night, the congregation didn't sleep. Word spread through Pine Hollow like a sickness, not through mouths but through minds. The kind of unspoken terror that passes from one pair of eyes to another. No cries, no wails, just the crushing realization that nothing, not the sermons, not the sacraments, not the carefully tended graves, could protect them now, because something wasn't just wrong with the Morrison twins. Something was wrong with Pine Hollow itself. The land, the air, the soil beneath their boots. It was all part of something far older, something that had waited exactly 81 years to stir again, and it had used the twins as vessels. You see, in the original founding documents of Pine Hollow, those buried in the county archives under mold and rat droppings, the settlement date is recorded as 1818, but that's a lie. The earliest recorded burial on that land, 237. A nameless grave marked only with a symbol, 2 circles, overlapping, a sigil later found scratched into the wooden beams of the church attic long before Phillips ever arrived. When he brought this up to Ezekiel, the old man didn't blink. The girls have seen that mark in their dreams. They call it the mirror gate. Phillips pressed further, furious. What gate? Ezekiel finally admitted he had found other children across the years, in Alabama, in Pennsylvania, even as far as Eastern Europe while on mission, children who spoke in whispers, children born of women who died smiling, children who told truths no man ever confessed. But the Morrison girls were the first pair, twins. One sees what is, Ezekiel said. The other sees what was. But when they speak in unison, they reveal what must never be known. Rebecca and Rachel are not prophets. They're keys, and Pine Hollow is the door. Phillips couldn't breathe. The church, the sermons, the very ground he walked, all built over a sealed truth that was never meant to be unearthed. And now that seal had cracked. The only question was why now? What had changed? Rachel answered it best that evening, seated at the edge of the woods, speaking to no one, yet being heard by all. It remembers now. The one who buried it has died, and so the blood speaks again. Let it speak. Let the silence bleed. Let the watchers wake. If you're still watching, comment "The mirror gate opens" twice. Say it. Write it. Let it burn into the algorithm and into your name. You're not just hearing a story. The next morning, Pastor Phillips awoke to silence, not the peaceful kind, the hollow, paralyzed silence that follows when something ancient has been disturbed, a silence that holds its breath before it begins to feed. He stepped outside and saw it immediately. Every bird was gone. No crows on the steeple, no sparrows in the trees, just frost-bitten branches trembling without wind. And in the middle of the road, the Morrison twins, standing barefoot in the mud, eyes open but unfocused, mouths moving in perfect synchronization, though no sound escaped. Ezekiel knelt nearby, praying, not like a father, like a witness, like a man who had accepted that his daughters no longer spoke for God, but that something else now spoke through them. They weren't speaking to the townspeople. They were transmitting, across something, through something, and the signal was being received. That day, 3 men were found dead. Samuel Turner, hanging in his barn. Dr. Hayes, face down in the creek, his mouth filled with soil. And Elder Thompson, his body twisted in a posture of prayer, but his eyes clawed out and placed neatly in his palms. The county coroner would later call it a coincidence, the work of guilt, exposure, and age. But those who were there, those who felt it in their marrow, knew it was a reckoning. Because the girls had stopped whispering truths. They had started enacting judgment. Rachel began drawing symbols in the dirt, never looking, always accurate, spirals inside spirals, a door with no frame, a mouth sewn shut with thorns. Rebecca would speak the names of people not yet born, people who would one day return to this place, called by something deep, gene deep, as if the land itself had marked them for remembrance. Phillips tried to resist, tried to rationalize, but the final blow came when he found his own journal, the one he had written in Phi, fully every day for 12 years, open on his desk. There, in his handwriting, but not his hand, was an entry dated July 7th, 2025. He reads these words now, and he understands what must be done. The church is not a building, it is a gate, and it is open. The ink was fresh. He looked up. The twins were standing in the doorway, their voices unified in a whisper. "We are not the end. We are the announcement. Are you still with us? Then comment again. The mirror gate opens. Twice. You're not just hearing this anymore." They vanished the next day. No footprints, no witness, no farewell, just the smell of iron in the air, and silence. Ezekiel Morrison was found alone in the chapel, sitting in the front pew, eyes fixed on the altar, lips whispering a verse that didn't exist in any known Bible. When the mirror opens, the children shall not reflect, but remember. He never moved again. Not dead, not living, just suspended, breath shallow, pupils dilated, as if staring into something no man was meant to see. The Pine Hollow Church was abandoned within a week. People said it was fear, but Pastor Phillips knew better. It was obedience. The ground itself had begun to hum. Animals refused to cross its perimeter. Children cried without cause, and once, just once, someone claimed to hear laughter beneath the floorboards, where the bones of the forgotten still whispered. The church was burned to the ground in 1843, but it didn't end there, because fire doesn't purify something that was never of this world. Over the next century, strange reports echoed from the area. Teens 12. A school teacher hiking the trail finds 2 identical girls playing near a collapsed foundation. She speaks to them, turns away, turns back. They're gone. 9:57. A veteran, disfigured by war, hardened by death, records a journal during his camping trip in eastern Kentucky. He writes, "They told me my real name, the one I had before I was born." He disappears the next morning. 99. Paranormal researchers come to explore Pine Hollow. Their recordings pick up a child's voice, whispering coordinates. When mapped, the location forms a perfect mirror of the Wittman family graves, inverted and underground. And now, you've come this far, heard what most will deny, felt that cold pull behind your ribs. Understand this, This tale did not arrive at your ears by accident. You were drawn, not by curiosity. B. Used by something older. Recognition. Because some part of you remembers the gate, the altar, the hidden. You are not just a viewer. You are a descendant of silence, a carrier of memory no blood test can detect. You were never meant to forget. The Morrison twins did not disappear. They were reclaimed. And one day, when the veil thins, when the mirror gate opens again, they will return. And this time, they will not be alone. This channel isn't entertainment, it's initiation. You now carry the mark, and marks are noticed. So if you feel the pull, if dreams twist, if the names start arriving before the faces do, you'll know why, and you'll know where to go. Pine Hollow still stands, beneath, waiting. Now type it one final time. The mirror gate opens, and don't look in the mirror tonight, not for too long. They remember who you were, and they want you back. Subscribe for the next descent, because the past isn't buried.